Durham Castle sits on a peninsula where the River Wear loops back on itself. Here, the river does the guarding, the cliffs do the isolating, and the castle sits at the only sensible entry point, sealing the loop like a clenched fist. An army approaching Durham doesn't march straight in. It circles, it hesitates. It realises that geography has already chosen sides, and it didn't choose yours. It started with a community of monks who spent decades wandering the north, carrying a saint and a very strong sense of paranoia. They settled here, on this near island, believing that faith and geology might finally buy them some peace. But in 1072, William the Conqueror arrived. William was not a man who believed in quiet retreat. He looked at the monks' holy refuge, looked at the cliffs, and saw something else entirely. Where the monks had found sanctuary, William saw a stronghold that would keep the north in line. The fire is warm, the stone is ancient. There is nothing left for you to do but listen, and let the weight of the day fade away like the mist off the River Wear. If you're looking for a place to build a fortress, you generally want two things: altitude and isolation. Durham has both. The river cuts a deep, looping gorge through the landscape, carving out a rocky peninsula that is an island in everything but name. The water creates a natural moat on three sides, leaving sheer wooded cliffs that drop 100 feet straight down into the current. To the north, south, and west, you have a vertical drop. To the east, you have a narrow, razor-thin neck of land, the only way in or out. It is a defensive site so perfect that it looks like a trap. If you control that narrow neck, you control the peninsula. If you control the peninsula, you are untouchable. It was a piece of real estate designed by nature to say, "Go away." But long before the first Norman mason looked at that rock and thought about arrow slits, the site was chosen by a group of exhausted men carrying a very heavy box. The story of Durham begins with the community of St. Cuthbert. These were not warriors, they were monks, and for the better part of a century they had been the world's slowest fugitives. They were carrying the coffin of St. Cuthbert, the holiest man in the north. Cuthbert had died in 687, but he refused to stay put. When the Vikings arrived, specifically the great heathen army led by men with terrifying names like Halfdan Ragnarsson, the monks realised that a remote island monastery like Lindisfarne was essentially a gift shop for raiders, so they packed up the saint and ran. For nearly 100 years the community wandered Northumbria. Imagine the logistics of this. You're trying to outrun Viking warbands while carrying a wooden coffin, relics, vestments, and likely a fair amount of gold. You're sleeping in barns, hiding in forests, and constantly looking over your shoulder for the silhouette of a longship. They needed a home, but not just any home. They needed a fortress that doubled as a cathedral. They needed a place that was spiritually pure but militarily viable. They needed Dunholm, the hill island. The legend of how they found it is one of those delightful medieval stories that balances the divine with the barnyard. According to local law in 995 AD, the monks were hopelessly lost. They knew the saint wanted to rest at Dunholm, but they had no idea where that was. The coffin, apparently deciding it had had enough of the walking, suddenly became immovable. It became heavy as lead. The monks pushed, pulled, and prayed, but the saint wasn't budging. Then they heard a voice. It wasn't an angel. It was a milkmaid asking another woman if she had seen her lost dun cow. The woman replied that she had seen the cow wandering up on Dunholm. The monks, realising that the cow had better navigation skills than they did, followed the milkmaid. She led them to the rocky peninsular loop of the River Wear. The coffin suddenly became light again. The saint had chosen his spot. It is a humbling thought that one of the greatest cathedral cities in Europe, a bastion of prince-bishops and military might, owes its location to a missing piece of livestock. Once they settled, the dynamic of the rock changed. It wasn't just a hideout anymore, it was a destination. St. Cuthbert was a celebrity saint. In the medieval economy, owning his body was like owning an oil field. Pilgrims flocked to the site. Kings sent gifts. The White Church, and later the great stone cathedral, rose on the plateau. But wealth attracts attention. And in the 11th century the attention wasn't coming from the Vikings anymore, it was coming from the Scots. King Malcolm III, known as Canmore, a big head, a nickname that was likely accurate in both literal and metaphorical terms, was the neighbour from hell. He treated the north of England as his personal ATM, raiding down the coast whenever the weather was nice. The monks quickly realised that prayer was good, but cliffs were better. The natural defences of the peninsula became the primary insurance policy for the saints' gold. The sheer slopes were reinforced with timber palisades. The narrow neck of land was guarded. The sanctuary was becoming a stronghold. Let's step inside the Saxon settlement in the year 1050. Outside, on the neck of the peninsula, the wind is howling up from the river gorge. It's cold, wet, and there are rumours that Malcolm's Scots are burning villages just 10 miles north. The world is a dangerous, biting place. But inside the white church, the air is still. The space is small compared to the giant cathedral that will come later, but it is intensely warm. Hundreds of beeswax candles are burning, filling the air with a honeyed, smoky scent. The stone walls are draped in colourful tapestries to keep out the draught. The shrine of the saint is glowing with gold leaf and garnets. You're a pilgrim who has walked for weeks to get here. You are kneeling on the rush-covered floor, your knees aching, your feet blistered. But you are safe. The sheer cliffs outside mean that no horseman can charge in here. The river is a wet wall protecting you. There is a low rhythmic chanting of the monks, the Opus Dei that vibrates through the floor. In a world of chaos, raid and fire, this hilltop is a pocket of absolute unshakable peace. You pull your wool cloak tighter, smell the incense, and for the first time in months you lower your shoulders. The saint is here. The cliffs are high. You're safe. But the Saxons were living on borrowed time. In 1066 the world broke. The Normans landed in the south. Hastings happened. The Saxon aristocracy was liquidated. For a few years the north remained wild. The Normans didn't like the north. It was cold, rebellious, and full of angry people. But William the Conqueror was not a man to leave a job half-finished. In 1069 he launched the Harrying of the North, a campaign of genocide and burning that broke the back of Northumbrian resistance. By 1072, William stood on the neck of the Durham Peninsula. He looked at the river gorge. He looked at the sheer cliffs. He looked at the strategic value of the hill island. He didn't care about the dun cow. He didn't care about the milkmaid. He saw exactly what he needed. A place to build a castle that would lock down the north of England forever. The monks were about to get a new landlord. And unlike the saint, this one carried a sword. In 1072, William the Conqueror stood on the peninsula of Durham and looked out over a silence he had created. He was returning from the Harrying of the North, a military campaign that makes modern, scorched-earth tactics look like aggressive gardening. The north of England had rebelled, and William's response was to burn the food, kill the livestock, and salt the earth. The result was a famine that lasted for a decade and a silence that stretched from York to the Scottish border. But even a wasteland needs a police station. William looked at the geography of Durham, the loop of the river, the sheer cliffs, the narrow neck of land, and saw the perfect place to lock the door on the north. He didn't care about the milkmaid or the dun cow. He cared about logistics. He needed a fortress that could stop a Scottish army coming south and a Northumbrian rebellion rising up. He ordered the construction of a castle, but William, being the busy CEO of a new and hostile takeover, didn't stay to lay the bricks. He outsourced the project to a man named Waltheof. Waltheof was a walking contradiction. He was the Earl of Northumbria, a native Anglo-Saxon aristocrat who had somehow managed to keep his head while all his peers were losing theirs. He was a relic of the old world, trying to survive in the new one. William essentially told him, "Build a cage for your own people, and I might let you live." So Waltheof oversaw the construction of the early motte and bailey. He mobilised the labour. He fortified the neck of the peninsula. He built the machine that would ensure Norman dominance over his own earldom. It didn't save him. The problem with being a collaborator in the 11th century is that the rebels hate you for helping the king, and the king hates you because he doesn't trust you. In 1076, Waltheof was implicated in a revolt. the revolt of the Earls, arrested and beheaded near Winchester. He was the last of the great Saxon earls. His castle was handed over to the new management. The Normans had learned a lesson. You can't trust a local to police the locals. You need an outsider, and preferably, you need one who believes God is on his side. Enter Bishop Walcher. Walcher was a native of Lorraine, modern-day France/Germany border. He was a man of culture, a man of the cloth, and completely unsuited for the shark tank of Northumbrian politics. William appointed him as the Bishop of Durham, but he added a twist. He also gave him the secular powers of an earl. This was the birth of a unique English monster, the Prince-Bishop. The logic was brutal but sound. The king was far away in London, or Normandy. The Scots were right next door. The north needed a ruler who could collect taxes with one hand and swing a sword with the other. By combining church and state into one person, William created a super governor. Walcher was the prototype. He was supposed to bring European sophistication to the savage north. It went poorly. Walcher was a decent man, surrounded by thugs. His knights, foreign mercenaries who viewed the locals as livestock, treated the region like a looting ground. They murdered a popular Saxon noble named Leolf, and the locals decided they had had enough. In May 1080, Walcher agreed to meet the local leaders at Gateshead to discuss grievances. It was a peace summit. The mob wasn't interested in apologies. They surrounded the church where Walcher had taken refuge. The bishop, realising the mood, tried to send out his knights to calm the crowd. The crowd butchered them. Finally, the mob set fire to the church. Walcher was faced with a grim choice: stay inside and burn, or walk out and face the steel. He chose the latter. He wrapped his robes around his face and stepped out of the burning doorway. He was hacked to pieces instantly. This was a wake-up call for the Normans. It proved that the north wasn't pacified. It was just waiting. The castle at Durham couldn't just be a symbolic administrative centre. It had to be a panic room for the entire administration. The castle was hardened. The new Prince-Bishops weren't taking any chances, and deep inside the fortress, they built the Norman chapel. This is the oldest surviving structure in Durham, dating to around 1080. If you walk into it today, the first thing that hits you is the smell. It smells of damp stone and old earth. It is subterranean, gloomy, and incredibly atmospheric. It feels like the bunker it was designed to be. The architecture is early Norman: thick pillars, round arches, heavy solidity. But look closely at the capitals, the tops of the columns. They are odd. In most Norman cathedrals, the carving is disciplined, geometric, or religiously standard. In the Durham Castle chapel, the carvings are wild. There are mermaids. There are hunting scenes. There are strange, pagan-looking beasts with staring eyes. Imagine it is 1085. The chapel is being finished. The bishop is safe upstairs, protected by a new garrison of very expensive mercenaries. Down here, in the cold, a local English stonemason is working. He's technically working for the Norman invaders. He's carving the pillars for their private chapel. But the Normans are busy upstairs, worrying about the Scots, so the mason carves what he knows. He doesn't carve a biblical scene. He carves a mermaid. He carves a stag hunt. He carves the folklore of the Northumbrian hills, the stories his grandmother told him before the Frenchmen arrived. It is a moment of naive art, a term historians use when they mean charming and slightly unhinged. But there is something deeply human about it. This mason was leaving his mark in the basement of his oppressors. The naive carvings are a rare survival of local English artistic expression within the rigid structure of Norman architecture. They are a whisper of the old world, trapped in the stone of the new. When the candles were lit for mass, the shadows of these strange beasts would dance on the walls. A mermaid swimming in the bishop's holy basement. It was a cosy, subversive little secret. But the chapel wasn't just for art. It was the spiritual engine room of a fortress that was about to become the most powerful political entity in northern England. The Prince-Bishops had learned their lesson from Walcher's death. Do not go to peace summits in wooden churches, stay in the stone castle, and make sure the walls are very, very thick. By the mid-12th century, the experiment was over. The Prince-Bishop was not just a title, it was a constitutional loophole that had grown into a kingdom. Welcome to the County Palatine of Durham. In the rest of England, if you committed a crime, you were tried in the king's name. If you paid taxes, the coin had the king's face on it. If you were called to war, you fought under the king's banner. In Durham, things were different. Here, the king's writ did not run. In Durham, you were answering to the bishop. The coins in your pocket, the Durham pennies, were minted in the castle. The army that marched south to fight the Scots didn't wait for orders from London. They waited for orders from the man in the mitre. There is a famous legal maxim from this era. Whatever the king has in the whole of England, the bishop has in the bishopric. The bishop was effectively the king of the north, and a king needs a palace that scares people. Enter Bishop Hugh de Puiset, pronounced Pudsey by the locals, because French names don't survive long in the north. Pudsey wasn't just a bishop. He was the nephew of King Stephen and wealthy beyond belief. He carried himself like a man who knew the world was watching. He didn't see Durham Castle as a bunker. He saw it as a stage. He looked at the grim military fortress of the Wiltshire era and decided it was too depressing. He wanted glamour. He wanted to show the world that the Prince-Bishop wasn't just a warlord. He was a sophisticated European prince. So he went shopping for architecture. His masterpiece is the entrance to the Great Hall. Today it is protected inside the later building, but in the 12th century it was the front door. And what a door! This is Romanesque architecture on steroids. It is a riot of geometric aggression. Deep zigzags, diamonds and chevrons carved into the stone with such depth that they seem to vibrate. Originally it would have been painted in vivid colours, reds, blues and golds. It wasn't just decoration, it was intimidation. Walking through that door meant walking into the mouth of the bishop's power. It said, "The man who lives here has money to burn and God on speed dial." But Pudsey didn't just want a nice door, he wanted a nice hallway. He built the Norman Gallery, a long arcaded corridor on the upper level overlooking the courtyard. This is significant. In a pure fortress, you don't build long, open galleries with beautiful arches. You build thick walls with tiny slits. A gallery is useless for defence, but it is perfect for conversation. Imagine it's 1170. You're a local baron, and you've been summoned to see the bishop. You aren't taken to a dark interrogation room. You're walked along the Norman Gallery. The bishop walks beside you, his robes swishing on the stone floor. Sunlight streams through the arches. He points out the view of the courtyard below. He asks about your family. He asks about your harvest. And then gently he asks why your tax payments are late. The gallery was a tool of soft power. It was a place for whispers, for deals, and for the subtle twisting of arms. It was architecture designed not to stop an arrow, but to start a rumour. If Pudsey was the diplomat, Bishop Anthony Beck was the tank. Beck, who ruled in the late 13th century, was the kind of bishop who wore armour under his vestments. He was arguably the most warlike of all the prince-bishops. He once led a personal retinue of 140 knights, 1,000 foot soldiers, and 500 horse into Scotland. That's not a bodyguard, that's an invasion force. Beck looked at Pudsey's hall and said, "Too small." He expanded the Great Hall until it was over 100 feet long. It became one of the largest halls in Great Britain, rivaling the King's Own halls in London. Let's step into Beck's Great Hall on March 20th, the Feast of St. Cuthbert. Outside, the wind is screaming off the North Sea, rattling the shutters, but inside the hall is a sensory overload of warmth. The sheer scale of the room is breathtaking. The timber roof is lost in the gloom of the smoke rising from the central hearth. The walls are hung with tapestries depicting the Crusades. Beck loved a good crusade. The tables are groaning under the weight of the feast. Roasted peacocks with their feathers reattached, whole boars, jellied eels, and gallons of wine imported from Gascony. The room is packed with the bishop's private army. These aren't monks. These are hardened killers who serve the church. The noise is deafening. The clash of knives, the roar of laughter, the barking of hunting dogs fighting for scraps under the tables. At the high table, Bishop Beck sits on a throne-like chair. He is eating off silver plates. He is the absolute master of this world. For a guest, this coziness is overwhelming. You're surrounded by food, heat, and military power. It is the ultimate expression of feudal security. You're in the belly of the beast, but the beast is feeding you. By 1300, Durham Castle had fully developed its split personality. From the outside, it was a terrifying fortress that guarded the border against the Scots. From the inside, it was a luxurious palace that rivaled the royal courts of Europe. The Prince-Bishops had achieved the impossible. They had turned a military outpost into a kingdom of their own. They had their own mint, their own army, their own laws, and their own golden doorway. But power is expensive, and the maintenance of a castle this size requires more than just money. It requires relevance. As the Middle Ages waned, the nature of the Prince-Bishop would be tested. The Scots were still a threat, but the kings in London were starting to get jealous. If the 13th century was the era of the rock-star bishop, the 14th century was the era where the bill finally came due. By 1346, England was busy. King Edward III was across the Channel in France, destroying the French army at the Battle of Crécy. The north of England was supposedly empty of soldiers. King David II of Scotland, a man with excellent timing but terrible intelligence reports, looked at the map and saw a "open for business" sign. He decided that this was the perfect moment to invade, burn Durham to the ground, and perhaps redecorate the cathedral with looting money. He was wrong. David marched south with a massive army, expecting to find nothing but frightened peasants and sheep. Instead, on October 17th, he ran into an English army at the Red Hills just outside Durham. The English army was a dad's army of the medieval world, led by the Archbishop of York and a collection of northern lords who were too old or too busy to go to France. But they had one weapon that David didn't account for, the corporal of St. Cuthbert. This wasn't a soldier, it was a piece of cloth. The monks of Durham had taken the Holy Corporax cloth, used to cover the chalice during Mass, of St. Cuthbert, stuck it on the end of a spear, and marched it out to the battlefield. It was the ultimate psychological weapon. As the armies lined up, a strange thing happened. The geography of Durham is tricky. Ravines, hills, tight corners. The Scots found themselves entangled in the enclosures and hedges, and then the mist came down. The mist legend says that St. Cuthbert himself rolled in the fog to confuse the invaders. Whether it was divine intervention or just typical British weather, the result was chaos. The Scottish formations broke. The English longbowmen, who didn't need to see you to kill you, opened fire. The battle wasn't a skirmish, it was a slaughter. The flower of Scottish nobility was cut down in the mud just a mile from the saint's shrine. And in the middle of the carnage was King David II. He didn't go quietly. He fought with the desperation of a man who knows his holiday is over. He was eventually cornered under a bridge, according to legend, or in a thicket. An English soldier named John Copeland demanded his surrender. David, showing a flash of royal temper, punched Copeland in the face, knocking out 2 of his teeth. Copeland responded by capturing him. But David had a problem. During the melee, he had taken an arrow to the face, not a scratch, but a deep, penetrating wound. He was hauled back to Durham Castle. Let's step into the Great Hall on the night of October 17th, 1346. The hall, Anthony Beck's massive 100-foot cavern of stone, is in chaos. It is filled with the victorious English lords, their armour stained with mud and blood. The adrenaline is fading, replaced by the exhaustion of survival. But in a side chamber, or perhaps near the great fire of the main hall, there is a quieter, grim intimacy. King David II is the King of Scots, but right now he is just a man in agony. The arrow shaft has been snapped off, but the head is still lodged in his face. Enter the barber surgeon. This is not a sterile environment. The surgeon likely washed his hands in a bowl of warm water that smells of rose water and vinegar, an early antiseptic. David is a prisoner, yes, but he is a noble prisoner. The English don't want him dead. He's worth a fortune in ransom. The arrowhead would have been difficult to remove, but it was removed. The wound was likely dressed with honey and linen. The king is alive. He's warm. He's safe from the battlefield. He's also looking at 11 years of captivity, mostly in the Tower of London, but tonight his prison is the most luxurious hall in the north. The castle has done its job. It has protected the bishop's interests, which now include the living body of the King of Scotland. Fast forward 150 years, the wars have cooled, the borders are quieter, and Durham Castle has a new problem: heating bills. By the late 1400s, the era of the warrior bishop living in a communal hall with 500 soldiers was over. The new bishops were administrators, politicians, and men who preferred privacy. Bishop Richard Fox looked at Anthony Beck's massive great hall and sighed. It was magnificent, yes, but it was also a draughty barn. Trying to heat a room that is 100 feet long and 40 feet high in a northern English winter is a fool's errand. You can burn an entire forest and still see your breath at the dinner table. So, Fox did something that would have made Anthony Beck scream. He shortened the hall. He didn't just put up a curtain, he built a stone wall. He sliced off the southern end of the hall, the service end, and converted it into practical space. He built the buttery, from the French bouteille, a room for storing liquor and wine, the pantry, from the French pain, a room for storing bread and dry goods. New kitchens, closer to the dining area so the food didn't arrive freezing cold. This was the domestic revolution. Fox realised that the castle didn't need to hold an army anymore. It needed to hold a dinner party. He sacrificed grandeur for comfort. The great hall became smaller, warmer, and more intimate. If you visit today, you're standing in Fox's shortened hall. The original dimensions of Beck's giant room are lost behind the walls of the kitchens and college offices. It was a structural admission that the medieval world was ending. The age of the hall life, where everyone from the bishop to the lowest dog boy slept in the same room, was gone. Privacy had arrived. Bishop Fox's renovation marks the moment Durham Castle stopped being a bunker and started becoming a residence. The arrow loops were blocked up, the fireplaces were improved, the ghosts of Neville's Cross were left outside in the mist, while inside the bishop enjoyed a hot meal in a room that didn't require a parka. But even as the castle grew cosier, the world outside was sharpening its knives again. The Tudors were coming, and they had very specific ideas about how much power a bishop should actually have. The Tudors came, and they hit hard. Throughout the 1500s, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I chipped away at the King in the North fantasy. They stripped away legal powers, they confiscated land, and they made it very clear that there was only one monarch in England. But the bishops of Durham were survivors. They weathered the Reformation, they kept their heads, and they kept their castle. By the early 17th century, the Prince-Bishop title was starting to feel a bit like a vintage suit. Expensive, impressive, but slightly out of step with the modern fashion of absolute monarchy. In 1633, King Charles I arrived in Durham. He was on his way to Scotland to be crowned, and he stopped at the castle for what was essentially the after-party of the decade. The bishop at the time threw a feast that would have made Anthony Beck nod in approval. The wine flowed, the venison was roasted, and the king sat in the shortened great hall surrounded by the power of the church. To Charles, this must have felt permanent. The walls were stone, the loyalty was absolute, and the divine right of kings felt as solid as the limestone cliffs outside. He didn't know he was the guest of honour at the monarchy's farewell party. He sat there, drinking the bishop's wine, completely unaware that outside those thick stone walls the fuse was already burning. Within a decade the country was at war with itself. The Civil War shattered the illusion of permanence. The divine right met the very human reality of a parliamentarian army. When the dust settled and the king's head was separated from his body, Oliver Cromwell's government looked at Durham Castle and didn't see a holy sight. They saw an asset. In a move that feels shockingly modern, they liquidated the bishopric. They stripped the title, fired the bishop, and put the castle on the market. It was bought by a London merchant named Thomas Andrews. For 10 years the castle rotted. The great hall grew damp, the tapestries moulded, the golden doorway of Pudsey gathered dust. The machine of power had been turned off, and the building began to die. But the 17th century was a pendulum. In 1660 the Republic collapsed, Charles II returned, and the bishops came home. Enter Bishop John Cossin. Cossin wasn't just a bishop, he was an interior designer with a grudge. He had spent the Civil War in exile in France, soaking up the Baroque grandeur of Paris. When he returned to Durham and saw his castle treating like a distressed asset, he didn't just clean it up, he reinvented it. Cossin wanted to make a statement. He wanted to scream, "We are back, and we are fancier than ever." His masterpiece is the Black Staircase. In a medieval castle, stairs are usually spiral, narrow, and designed to make it easy to stab someone coming up them. They are defensive. Cossin's staircase is pure theatre. It is a flying staircase, rising through 4 stories without any visible central support. It creates a massive, open well in the centre of the building. The engineering is daring. It relies on the structural integrity of the oak and the walls to keep from collapsing. But it's the treads that tell the real story. Look at the steps. They're incredibly wide and surprisingly shallow. You can't run up them. If you try, you look ridiculous. This was intentional. Cossin designed the staircase for processional dignity. He knew that a bishop in full ceremonial robes, heavy velvet, gold embroidery, a train of silk, cannot lift his knees very high. If the steps are steep, the bishop looks like he is struggling. He looks human. But on the black staircase, with its shallow rise, the bishop doesn't climb. He glides. He ascends effortlessly, the robes trailing behind him like water. It was architecture designed to turn a walk upstairs into a divine ascension. It was the ultimate power move. Let's step onto the landing of the black staircase. It is 1800. It is midnight. The castle is silent. The servants have gone to bed in the lower quarters. The bishop is asleep in his stateroom. The only light comes from a single candle you're holding, and the moonlight spilling in through the high windows, casting long, distorted shadows of the banister rails onto the wall. The air smells intensely of beeswax and lavender polish. For centuries, servants have rubbed the black oak until it shines like dark glass. It is a comforting, domestic smell, the smell of a house that is cared for. You run your hand along the banister. It is cool and smooth. The wood is carved with intricate fruit and flowers, pineapples, a symbol of hospitality, and acanthus leaves. It feels solid, a piece of craftsmanship built to last 1,000 years. But then you hear it. It sounds like the stiff fabric of a Victorian dress brushing against the oak. This brings us to the Grey Lady. Every good castle needs a ghost, and the black staircase is the haunt of the Grey Lady of Durham. The story varies, as all good legends do. Some say she was the wife of a bishop, which would be scandalous given the celibacy rules, though later Anglican bishops were married. Others say she was a niece. The legend is tragic and abrupt. She was walking down these very stairs, perhaps in a hurry, perhaps distracted, and she tripped. Because the staircase is an open well, she didn't just fall down a step, she fell over the banister. She plummeted 4 stories through the dark void of Cossin's masterpiece, landing on the stone flags below. They say she still walks the stairs. She doesn't scream, she isn't violent, she just walks. Imagine standing there in the dark, smelling the beeswax, feeling the safety of the heavy oak, and then seeing a figure in grey silk gliding up the shallow steps. She isn't ascending to heaven like the bishop. She is endlessly repeating the ascent she never finished. It is a cosy haunting. It isn't terrifying. It is melancholic. It fits the building perfectly. Durham Castle is a place of layers, Saxon monks, Norman soldiers, Baroque bishops, and the Grey Lady is just one more resident who refuses to leave. She's part of the furniture now, as permanent as the black oak itself. Cossin's restoration was the last great gasp of the Prince-Bishops as feudal lords. The staircase was magnificent, the hall was restored, and the power seemed secure. But the world was changing. The Industrial Revolution was coming. The mines were opening in County Durham. The people didn't want a king in the north anymore. They wanted democracy, or at least better wages. By 1832 the writing was on the wall. The vast powers of the bishopric, the army, the courts, the taxes, were stripped away by Parliament. The prince part of the title died, leaving just the bishop and the castle. It was too big for a simple clergyman. It was a dinosaur skeleton, magnificent but uninhabitable. It needed a new purpose, or it would go the way of the Roman villas. By 1832 the prince-bishop was an endangered species. The industrial world had no patience for medieval warlords in mitres. The Reform Act was passing through Parliament, stripping away the ancient feudal powers. The last of the breed was Bishop William Van Mildert. Van Mildert saw the writing on the wall. He was sitting on a massive, draughty, expensive pile of limestone that had been built to fight Vikings and Scots, threats that had been dead for centuries. He realised that if the church didn't do something useful with the castle, the state would simply take it away. So he made the ultimate pivot. He gave it away first. In 1832 he donated the castle to found the University of Durham. It was a genius move. He transformed a relic of feudal oppression into a bastion of enlightenment. He swapped the garrison for undergraduates. But there was a problem. The actual keep, the central strong point on the motte where the soldiers used to sleep, was a wreck. It was a ruin of jagged stones and weeds. Enter Anthony Salvin. Salvin was a Victorian architect who specialised in restoration. In 1840, Salvin looked at the ruin and rebuilt it from the ground up. But he didn't build a fortress, he built a dormitory. The octagonal keep you see today isn't the one William the Conqueror built. It is a Victorian fantasy of what a keep should look like. But inside it wasn't designed for archers, it was designed for geography majors. He carved up the interior into study bedrooms. This created the most unique student housing in the world. While students in London were living in garrets, students in Durham were living in a Norman keep, climbing spiral stairs to get to their lectures. While Salvin was fixing the top, the bottom was trying to escape. The sheer cliffs of the peninsula are impressive, but gravity is patient. By the 19th century, the massive weight of the medieval kitchens and the Great Hall was slowly pushing the outer walls toward the river gorge. The castle was sliding. The solution was not subtle, it was brute force engineering. They built the flying buttresses. These are not the delicate, lace-like buttresses you see on a French cathedral. These are massive, solid stone props that look like muscular arms pushing against the cliff face. They're architectural crutches, leaning into the rock to hold the stone giant upright. If you walk along the river path below, you can see them looming above you, moss-covered, damp, and absolutely essential. They are a reminder that this building is fighting a constant war against physics. Durham is alive. It smells of floor polish and toast. It has noise, the sound of footsteps running down the black staircase, the hum of conversation in the Undercroft bar, which used to be a crypt. It is a fortress that never stopped being used. Durham Castle was never meant to be peaceful. It was born from fear, from flight, from the long memory of raids, borders and enemies just beyond the horizon. Its hill was chosen because it was hard to reach. Its walls were raised because someone, somewhere, was always expected to come. For centuries the castle did exactly what it was asked to do. It guarded saints. It projected power. It ruled like a king without ever wearing a crown. It watched Scotland. It imprisoned kings. It echoed with armour, sermons, commands and judgment. And then gradually it was asked to do something else. The swords were set aside, the banners were folded away, the courts grew quiet, the threats faded into history books and footnotes. The walls remained, but they no longer waited for war. Today the castle still wakes up early, but now it wakes to footsteps, not musters, to murmured conversations, not shouted orders, to the scrape of chairs and the turning of pages. Students cross the same courtyard where Prince-Bishops once ruled like monarchs. Breakfast is served in the same great hall where knights gathered and kings were held. Laughter rises where once there were prayers for victory or mercy. The river still bends around the hill just as it always has. This stone still holds the warmth of the sun and the damp of the north. The castle still stands watch, though it no longer remembers what it was watching for. Durham Castle was never abandoned. It was repurposed, from fortress to palace, from palace to institution, from power to persistence. It no longer guards the north. It guards time.